Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad that so many students and professors, colleagues are in the audience. I'm very honored that we have two distinguished speakers with us, Professor Hans-Georg Moeller and Professor Fabian Heubel. And I think I will just briefly introduce our session in Chinese, and then let's begin. But the talk is in English. So 今天我简单的会介绍一下这两位发言人哈，我今天真的很荣幸啊，请到这个Moeller教授。你们都知道，我们9月份成立了一个中国哲学外文资料中心的演讲系列，所以今天是这个系列的演讲系列的第2场。那我们很荣幸请到这个Moeller教授。Moeller教授是一个可以说最活跃的汉学家，德国汉学家之一，或者甚至可以说最活跃的国际的汉学家之一。他是德国人哈，所以他师从这个波恩学派，就是他的老师是 Rolf Trautzettel， 在德国啊，这个波恩学派的德国是相当有名的一个汉学啊，比较以哲学一个哲学啊的视角来切入中国文化的一种学派，就是他的研究方法比较独特啊，因为以这个是问题意识啊、哲学意识为主。慢慢这个Moeller教授很早，可以说很早就成名了哈。他最早的著作我还记得，我看就是90年代中啊看到这本书啊，就是他是这个应该是他第一本的啊，就是《麻王堆汉墓帛书》啊这本书啊，就是老子啊《道德经》啊nach den Seitentexten von麻王堆1995年。所以啊，从他的博士论文开始啊，对这个道家哲学有兴趣啊，但是就是他其实还有另外一个很重要的一个问题，就是这个古代啊中国哲学中的语言观，所以有这本书《Die Bedeutung der Sprache in der frühen chinesischen Philosophie》，我可以让大家看一下啊，就是这个是他的博士论文，然后就是应该说第2本啊，就是这个刚刚我所介绍的这个麻王堆的这个汉墓帛书啊，然后之后啊，他相当快速的出版了好几本啊，就是几乎每1-2年都有1本啊，所以像这个 Daoist Explained from the Dream of the Butterfly to the Fisherman Allegory， 2004年啊，用英文出版的，或者像杰士卢曼啊，从灵魂到体系啊。就是 Luhmann Explained from Souls to Systems， 也是2006年出版的。所以你们看到，他除了道家哲学以外，还有另外一个很重要的一个哲学专场啊，就是这个鲁曼啊的系统理论啊，所以可以说是在这个属于这个德国社会哲学啊，这个就是鲁曼这个是这个德国社会哲学里面很重要的代表。那然后他最新的著作是《The Moral Food》啊，2009年也是英文在美国出版的一本专门探讨道德问题的著作。所以说Moeller教授的这个书相当多啊，所以我们今天很荣幸啊，请到这个Moeller教授来我们中国哲学外文资料中心啊。你们都知道我们在推广啊这个国外的中国哲学方面的研究啊，所以我们希望啊这个 foster the dialogue 啊，就是促进这个对话啊，就是中西之间啊的这个对话，所以我想Moeller教授就是一个不可或缺的一个重要的人物啊，在我们的中心出现是应该的啊。然后你们看他的书啊，现在也逐渐的翻成中文，所以像我们图书馆最近买的这本书，中文系买的这本书啊，就是《道德经》的哲学，一个德国人研中的老子，所以已经有就是他的著作已经被翻成中文，也是好事啊，所以我就不多说了。我就把时间交给这个Moeller教授，然后我们今天啊，就是今天的演讲题目是 Rambling Without Destination on Daoist Yoing in the World， 非常期待啊，请大家欢迎Moeller教授。我也许再说几句啊，就是我们今天大概就是Moeller教授跟我说，他大概需要40到45分钟的时间，然后接下来我们请何发笔啊，中央研究院文哲所的研究员哈。做一个回应哦，大概我预计大概20到25分钟的时间， 是不是？或者是你看你要讲多久？对，就是这个何乏笔老师，我想我不需要很详细的做介绍啊，大家都应该都听过或者知道啊。何乏笔老师他的研究角度其实跟 Moeller 教授蛮，可以说有一些相似的地方啊。他们两个人都对于，这是我的了解，我不知道两个人这个可以修正一下啊，如果我误解他们的这个研究立场，那两个人好像都对这个所谓的西方18世纪的这个欧洲啊启蒙运动有一些不满啊，就是这个所谓的 Western rationality 啊，或者 Enlightenment 这样的一个哲学计划、哲学活动有一些不满啊，因此就试图在这个欧洲以外寻找一些哲学资源啊，重新探讨这个现代性啊 modernity 啊，以及对就是这个全球性啊 globality 或者这种全球哲学或者 global philosophy 这样的一些议题，所以何乏笔比较是从妇科来切入道家哲学，那Moeller教授据我了解比较是从尼采或者也许鲁莽，是不是？就这样的一个角度切入道家哲学，所以我蛮期待他们两个人的对谈。好，那我就不多说了。
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kai, for inviting me here. Very honored to speak here, and looking forward to the discussion. I'm sorry, my Chinese is very bad, so I will just speak in English. I see most of you, or some of you at least, have the actual manuscript, right? I will just read through the manuscript, and then we have some discussion, hopefully, afterwards. All right. So the topic is rambling without destination. A.C. Graham, who is one of the previous generation leading philosophers who did Chinese philosophy and translated a lot of things into English. This is very influential for, let's say, the contemporary reception of Chinese philosophy in the Western world, both in Europe and in America. A.C. Graham translated the title of the first chapter of the Zhuangzi, 逍遥游, in Chinese as going rambling without a destination. The crucial word in this expression is yo, which on its own Graham often renders as roaming. The addition to yo in the chapter title, 逍遥, means something like carefree, and serves to underline what one may call the happy-go-lucky character of this specific mode of moving around. Yo, in the sense of roaming or rambling, and I will turn to this slightly alternative translation only towards the end of this paper, is without a doubt a very important term in the Zhuangzi. It not only occurs in the title of the first chapter, but altogether 95 times in the whole text. And if one also adds the 10 occurrences of the basically synonymous character yo with the water radical, even more than 100 times. There are only very few philosophically significant terms that are used with such frequency in this core Daoist text, in the Zhuangzi, right? So I think it's really a term that is significant. One of the most famous passages about yo in the Zhuangzi is the happy fish dialogue between Zhuangzi and his philosopher friend Heubel, very famous passage. There has been a lot of discussion, a lot of explanations, a lot of interpretations of this famous passage. Usually they don't really take into account this notion of yo, which I personally think is quite central to the passage, right? So in the English translation, the passage, the happy fish story goes like this. You will all be familiar, but I just repeat the English translation because, again, I think it's significant for a philosophical interpretation, how this is translated into English. So, I quote, Zhuangzi and Heubel were roaming around, yo, and got to a bridge above the Hao River. The minnows swim around, and again it's the same character, yo, so free and easy, said Zhuangzi, that's how the fish are happy. Huishe said, you are not a fish, whence do you know that the fish are happy? Zhuangzi replied, you aren't me, whence do you know that I don't know the fish are happy? Huishe said, we'll grant that not being you, I don't know about you. You'll grant that you are not a fish, and that completes the case that you don't know the fish are happy. Zhuangzi said, let's go back where we started. When you said, whence do you know that the fish are happy? You asked me the question already knowing that I knew. I knew it from up above the Hao River. So that's the end of this short story. The dialogue can be interpreted as a playful philosophical dispute between Huishe, the epistemological skepticist, as we may want to call him, and Zhuangzi, the Daoist. Rather than giving in to Huishe's reasoning, Zhuangzi finally wins the argument by turning Huishe's own words against him in a linguistic pun. When Huishe asked whence, which means in English something like where from, he, Zhuangzi, knew about the happiness of the fish. He implicitly admitted that Zhuangzi already knew about their happiness. If one takes into account the second pun in the story as well, namely the parallel use of the term yo for both Zhuangzi's and Huishe's way of moving around and the motion of the fish, it can further be said that despite the specious difference between Zhuangzi and the fish, which confines one of them to a life on land and the other to a life in water, they still share something like a common mode of moving around in the world, namely yo, and thus are capable of sharing their happiness, right? Because both of them are in the mode of yoing. You can say this implies that they share some sort of common ground that Zhuangzi in the beginning already sort of assumes. For the time being, however, I intend to leave the philosophical meaning of the dialogue behind and, so to speak, move away from the bridge over the Hao and take a closer look at the term yo and its meanings in the Zhuangzi and by extension in Daoism. I will, however, return to the bridge towards the end of this paper. Yo, in the sense of roaming, is, right at the beginning of the text, associated with the movement of fish and birds. The Xiaoyao chapter, and thus the book itself, begins with a depiction of a mythical fish named Kun, who transforms into a mythical bird named Peng, traversing the world. So right at the beginning we have these fish and the birds, and they're already introduced as somehow, roaming in the sense of yo. I think it is highly significant that this Daoist type of moving around is exemplified by the motion of animals. And as has been pointed out by my colleague in Ireland, Graham Parkes, that these animals are quite removed from the human species by not being mammals. Graham's translation of yo as roaming is therefore, I think, very appropriate for yo, right? It is introduced as a notion of movement that is particular representative of how animals move in the world. So, as opposed to terms referring to human movement, such as traveling, journeying, or going, roaming designates an aimless wandering that is not focused on getting from a starting point A to a final destination B. It is neither spatially nor temporally framed by an intentional beginning and end. It is rather a mode of motion one can be in or not, and one that fish, birds, or for that matter, Taoist sages may enter. In this sense, it may well be comparable to, for instance, being asleep, a mode of consciousness that one also cannot consciously get into or out of, right? We cannot say, now we start to sleep, and we cannot say, now we stop to sleep. We're either in this mode or not. And that does not also not lead from a purposeful start to a specific finish point. The closest personal experiences I had in my life to this kind of movement, to this kind of yo-ing, if you want to put it in English, at least as far as I can remember, date back to my childhood. Having been lucky enough to grow up in the countryside and at a time when children were often simply outside in company of other children who happened to be around, I don't know how much this is true for you growing up in Taipei, presumably having grown up in a city like Taipei. So I spent quite a few days, or at least mornings or afternoons, with such aimless drifting around. Of course, this aimlessness did not mean that we were not frequently looking for something, or usually not really knowing exactly for what, or that we did not have any practical concerns at all. Roaming animals, like children presumably, will be constantly aware of their surroundings, having great sensitivity, so for instance for food or water that may be close by, or for an enemy who is approaching. While roaming, children and animals will switch to, for instance, a gathering, hunting, or fleeing mode from time to time. But again, this does not lead them from a specific starting point A to another specific point B. I am afraid I personally and increasingly lost the capacity for such roaming in the countryside when getting older. On the other hand, perhaps as a toddler, I may have been capable of such endless roaming simply in my bedroom. So today, even when hiking for pleasure, which many Germans do actually, just spoken with Christian about the thing. So even when hiking for pleasure nowadays, I usually rely on a map and have a certain goal, or at least a path fixed before venturing out. Right? I make up in my mind, today I'm going from here to there, and it will probably take about, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, and then I drive back from where I came. So while on the move then, I'm often anxiously making sure not to get lost. There is hope, though, for this. Once during a class on Daoism that I taught in the United States, I talked about that apparent inability of human adults to experience yo in their own everyday activities. I was, however, contradicted by some of the participants. Several mature, as they are called in the US, female students assured me quite convincingly that they would regularly enter an at least somewhat comparable state of yoing, namely when shopping. There's a nice rainbow. It was soothing to come to know that such ancient Taoist forms of motion can be pursued even right at the heart of contemporary capitalism, right? Women who, I might have skipped this because of the rainbow. So the women assured me that they would enter such kind of yoing, such kind of roaming, such kind of aimless drifting when going on a shopping tour, right? To a shopping center, where they also sort of lose themselves in their surroundings, but at the same time having, of course, heightened attention for everything that might, be attractive or dangerous or whatsoever. In sum, the term yo in the Zhuangzi can refer to an itinerant form of life and inhabiting the world which is common to animals such as fish and birds. This very form of life is shared by the Daoist sage who, to speak with the Zhuangzi again, and this is a quote, has abodes for no longer than a morning. Yo refers to a mobile form of dwelling within one's surroundings, subject to constant change, and without orientation towards a final goal. This non-teleological or carefree type of, so to speak, being on the way is at the same time one of heightened awareness. It is not a dumb or inattentive state of mere vegetation, but rather open and sensitive to all kinds of stimuli and environmental triggers. Thus, while lacking any utilitarian focus on final outcomes or net results, it is a both pragmatically efficient and aesthetically pleasurable form of existence. Looking at the numerous occurrences of yo in the Zhuangzi, it becomes clear, however, that this profane use of yo, indicating an itinerant, aimless, and attentive way of moving around in the world, concretely practiced by animals and sages, is complemented by what could be called a more poetic use of the term, illustrating a more, so to speak, elevated form of existence. A sage may, I quote, roam in the wilderness where no humans are, yo yu renjiya, as a recluse outside of society. Such an existence outside the human sphere can be extended beyond all confinements. And in these instances, the Zhuangzi speaks about roaming the limitless, yo wu qiong, or roaming the realm of nothing whatever, yo wu he yo zhi xia, or of the one who roams in what I call non-presence, yo yu wu yo zhi. Similarly, a sage may roam the land without borders, yo wu ji ji, or roam the boundless, yo wu duan. One passage in chapter 11 of the Zhuangzi depicts a dialogue between a Daoist sage and an obviously yet unenlightened question. Describing his state of being, the sage says, "I floatingly roam, not knowing what I am getting at. I am wildly crazy, not knowing where I go to." Chinese, 富有不知所求，状况不知所往. In these instances, the sages or mythic figures who engage in this kind of roaming, are not simply strolling around like Zhuangzi or the fish, but have entered some extraordinary state of, for lack of a better word, trance. Perhaps more reminiscent of the appearance of shamans rather than children, these figures are somewhat aloof, difficult to talk to, seemingly erratic and detached. The language in which they talk or with which they are described is much bolder and lyrical and much less plain than that used, for instance, in the dialogue between Heubel and Zhuangzi. So it's a very different kind of linguistic setting also that this usage of yo occurs in. If one would still be allowed to make such a distinction, one could say that the quite striking linguistic differences between the more prosaic passages in the Zhuangzi on the one hand, and the other more mannerist on the other, mirror a difference between the philosophical and religious dimensions of this text, the Dao Jiao and the Dao Jia, so to speak, aspects of the Zhuangzi. Be that as it may, so I think there are sort of at least two, but probably more sort of also linguistic levels in the text, and this also reflects on the usage of yo. Be that as it may, the roaming ones in these poetic passages are often but not always single, in every case they're probably male, accomplished Taoist sages, dwelling wonderfully and strangely in some other dimension, altogether different from those, if there are any, they encounter. And so when we have these loftily yoing people, they are usually somewhat, as I said, distant from everyone around them. The profound difference between these sages and others is explicitly stressed in some passages, and I think that's interesting. They roam in different realms. These sages are outside of or beyond some confined sphere, as in the many passages that I quoted before, as these passages explicitly say, or these expressions. Actually, these different spheres of roaming are used to indicate the not so much essential as existential differences between Taoists and Confucians. In one passage in chapter 6 of the Zhuangzi, Confucius, as always concerned with mourning rituals, had sent one of his disciples, Zhigung, to take part in a funeral of a Taoist sage. When Zhigung arrives, he sees the two Taoist sage companions of the deceased happily celebrating the death of their friend. Also, of course, a very famous passage. When Zhigung reports his encounter to Confucius, the master explains to him what sort of people these supposed Daoist mourners are. And I quote, "They are the sort that roams beyond the guidelines," said Confucius. "I am the sort that roams within the guidelines. Beyond and within have nothing in common, and to send you to mourn was stupid on my part. They are at the stage of being fellow men with the maker of things, and go roaming in the single breath that breathes through heaven and earth. Heedlessly they go roving beyond the dust and grime, go rambling through the lore in which there is nothing to do. How could they be finicky about the rights of common custom, on watch for the inquisitive eyes and ears of the flounder?" End of quote. So again, we have this very poetic, lofty language here, and a very strong insistence on these two realms, right? You can either roam beyond the world of ordinary men and animals, or you can roam within their world. So, no longer concerned with the shift from life to death, a Taoist sage is capable, as the text says about these three companions, of, again I quote, "climbing the sky, roaming the mists, and go whirling into the infinite." End of quote. So these people do not swim in water like fish, or walk on the earth like Huishe and Zhuangzhou, but have propelled themselves to loftier grounds and are somewhat bird-like, as it is famously said of the elusive Taoist master Liezi, riding the wind. You will know that passage too, for this expression. This is apparently how they roam. In the Zhuangzi, the term yo also appears several times along with the term xin, or heart-mind. Here it is used as a verb in a causative fashion, following Graham's translation, so that the expression yo xin means to let the heart-mind roam. There are cases where this phrase is used parallel to yo on its own. Just as mentioned above, there is the expression roaming the limitless, yo yu wu qiong. We find yo xun yu wu qiong, so letting the heart-mind roam in the limitless. Obviously, both expressions yo and yo xin are quite similar. However, yo xin adds a more specific sense to the notion of yoing that is worth exploring a little further. The expression yo xin indicates that the yoing of the sages is something that their heart mind does. While on the one hand it is their general mode of existence, it is also the way their xin operates. There are three occurrences in the inner chapters shedding some more light on what this entails. One, in chapter 4, says, I quote, "To let the heart mind roam with other things as its chariot, and by trusting to the inevitable nurture the center of you, is the farthest one can go." And another passage in chapter 5 depicts yet one more Taoist sage saying, again I quote, "Such a man cannot even tell apart the function of eyes and ears, and lets the heart mind go roaming in harmony with the efficacy or power." Acknowledging the difficulty of interpreting these once more rather poetic proclamations, yo xin still seems to refer to a state of intensified bodily and mental awareness and capacity as an effect of Taoist cultivation. I think it's a state that Taoist practice sort of brings about. This is confirmed by the third occurrence of yo xin in the inner chapters. In chapter 7, an obscure man without a name instructs an equally obscure figure who apparently intends to become a sage ruler by pointing out, I quote, "Let your heart mind roam in the flavorless, blend your qi with the featureless, follow the self-so of things, leave no room for what is selfish, and the empire will be in order." Right? Again, more or less an instruction you can find for Taoist practice in, for instance, Taoist groups who practice whatever exercises, qi exercises, qigong or things like that. So here, by being directly aligned with the cultivation of qi energy, being in accord with the self-soul, the ziran of nature, and the elimination of a peculiar self, the roaming heart-mind is clearly meant to indicate a perfect state of body and mind as an effect of Daoist nurture, some sort of xiushan effect. This physiological dimension of the practice of youxin is all the more evident in the following fictitious dialogue between a flabbergasted Confucius and an enlightened Lao Tzu, occurring in chapter 21 of the Zhuangzi, and reminiscent of the famous opening scene of chapter 2, where Nan Guozhi lost his self, Sanguo. I quote again now from chapter 21. Confucius visited old Dan, old Lao Tzu. Old Dan, fresh from a bath, was drying out, hair hanging down his back, so still that he seemed other than human. Confucius said, "Just now, sir, your body was as motionless as withered wood, as though you had left everything behind and parted from humankind to take your stand in the unique." And then Lao Tzu says, "I was letting the heart-mind roam at the beginning of things. The heart-mind is straitened by it and incapable of knowing. The mouth gapes at it and it is unable to speak. The utmost yin is somber, the utmost yang is radiant. The somber goes on emerging from the sky, and the radiant goes on issuing from the earth. The two pervade each other, and by their perfected harmony, things are generated." Confucius said, "Let me ask about your roaming in this." Lao Tzu replied, "To grasp it is utmost beauty, utmost joy. One who grasps utmost beauty and roams in utmost joy is called the utmost human." End of quote. This text, both regarding its content and language, strongly resembles later Taoist writings on cultivation of the body, right? These xiushan methods, and the heart-mind, which have been previously referred to as texts of Taoist religion, Daojiao, and may now perhaps be better classified as texts on Taoist practice. So in this context, letting the heart-mind roam, youxin is an expression for exercising Taoist utmost humanity, the exercise of trying to become zhiren or practicing zhiren. It is interesting to note that just as different ways of roaming distinguish Taoist sages from Confucians, different ways of letting the heart-mind roam distinguish also Taoists from Mohists and other heretic disputers of the Tao. The latter, as chapter 8 of the Zhuangzi says, and I quote again, "Let their heart-minds roam among questions about the hard and the white, the same and the different, and fatuously admire useless propositions." So apparently how one roams indicates quite precisely who one is, particularly as a philosopher. Right? Mohis youxin in a different way than Taoist youxin. It's a different form of philosophical practice and religious practice. After these excursions, I would like to return to the bridge across the Hao River. It now seems that there are at least two ways of reading that short dialogue. They are not mutually opposed or directly contradictory, but still quite different. In light of the just presented more poetic, if you want, more religious or more practical occurrences of Yo in the Zhuangzi, which seem to somewhat overshadow the more prosaic and profane usages of this term, we might simply say that Zhuangzi is a Taoist sage and thus fully capable of Yoing in its highest form, and that therefore Huishe is no match for him. Huishe only roams within those boundaries that Zhuangzi has long crossed and annihilated. Poor Huishe, just like those Mohists and Confucians, lets his heart-mind stray and deal with pointless questions and language games. He seems to be confined to quote from the Zhuangzi, these other passages that I mentioned, the inquisitive eyes and ears of the vulgar supply him with. Only Zhuangzi's way of roaming, his form of yoing, allows him to experience this utmost joy described by the old Lao Tzu. This kind of joy transcends the narrow boundaries of his self and enables the Taoist sage to share it with the fish, or his natural environment in general. The existential mode of yoing in the world makes the sage part from humankind and roam the limitless. Right? So this is one way we could read the story of Zhuangzi and Puishe, taking into account this religious sort of meaning of yo. However, another reading can be based on the more mundane, profane, and concrete meaning of yo as rambling without destination. This reading can point to the fact that in the story, Puishe and Zhuangzi are, after all, yoing together and stroll around in this earthly sense of yo, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, how, let's say, a group of children just wanders around and plays along a river, for instance. They are simply walking side by side and do not seem as existentially apart as the obscure sages and their unsophisticated questioners in so many other passages in the Zhuangzi. So again, what I'm trying to say here is, if we look at the meaning of yo in the first more religious meaning, this would imply that Zhuangzi yos like Taoist sages do, which is in a different realm than the more mundane people like the Mohists and the Confucians, as in so many other passages that are pointed to, right? So this would make a strong distinction between the way the state, let's say, Zhuangzi is in and Puishe is in, right? But if we look at yo in the more profane way, then we can say they're just yoing together. They're both like fish or children, for that matter, engaged in some sort of roaming around. And I would say that this story does not really fit the narrative pattern of the religious sort of sense of yo, and that it's also written markedly differently in style. So again, I think the yo as it occurs in the River How story is not the religious yo. It's used in perfectly plain language. So there is no hint at this sort of religious dimension that Zhuangzi is in, as opposed to Puishe. So Zhuangzi uses no lofty vocabulary here. He does not point to anything limitless or beyond the common. Both Zhuangzi and Puishe, like the fish, move around leisurely and aimlessly. And perhaps they also talk or philosophize in this very way with one another. Perhaps the short dialogue only presents a concrete example of the, so to speak, useless pleasure of philosophical rambling. And perhaps this is what Taoist yoing means here. Perhaps the Happy Fish story illustrates this intellectual, but at the same time also social and physical engagement in a simultaneously playful and challenging, foolish and witty and humorous form of communication that does not lead to any end or conclusion, but that is enjoyable and meaningful as such, right? So that Zhuangzi and Puishe are yoing in some sort of a playful way, and doing this together rather than being separate. From a strictly historical perspective, the first and more elevated reading is probably more convincing. Scholars such as the American sinologist Harold D. Roth have shown, as they have shown, preaching Taoism was already very much concerned with cultivation practices aiming at reaching a sage-like form of extraordinary existence. With the development of a well-documented proper Taoist religion in all its varieties, such practices became all the more important and central later on. There is nothing that prevents one from interpreting the Happy Fish story, and particularly the notion of yoing, in the larger context of such efforts to let the heart-mind roam. So this religious reading, I think, is possible. However, philosophically speaking, I prefer the second, more mundane reading, in the second, more mundane sense of yo. It is questionable, of course, in how far philosophical musings are scholarly acceptable. Scholars of Taoism, for instance, in departments of sinology, are expected to analyze texts and traditions on the basis of historical and philological evidence and to remain as neutral with respect to the sources as possible. In my view, too, historical and philological accuracy is not only important but crucial. If dealing philosophically with Daoist texts, though, one may want to add something to historical and philological analysis, an attempt to make the text one deals with relevant within a philosophical discourse. Examples for this method exist. Confucian texts, for instance, have been made philosophically relevant by authors such as Roger Ames and or Henry Roseman, who have both historically identified ancient Chinese role ethics and recommended to take it seriously as a source for contemporary role ethics as a valid alternative to other current forms of ethics stemming from Western traditions. What I'm trying to say here is my reading is informed, my general approach to Taoism is informed not only by the desire to, on the one hand, read the texts in a philologically accurate manner, but also to make them philosophically relevant for contemporary discourses. So I try also to, if you want, try to see what can be done philosophically with passages just the one, as the one that I just discussed. There is no lack of such attempts with respect to Taoist sources. Personally, I'm afraid, though, they have often been less successful than their Confucian counterparts. So we have a Xin Rujia, but we don't really have a Xin Daojia to that extent. So mystical appropriations of Taoist sources have sometimes led to associations with New Age or spiritual literature of our times. I think that texts like the Zhuangzi deserve better, and it is probably in order for interpreters of Taoism who have jobs as philosophers that they come up with some ways of making these sources interesting. If, as I think it is both philologically and historically possible, one interprets the happy fish story and the Taoist notion of yoing in the world as referring to a mode of mundane conversation rather than a mode of existential religious elevation, one may conceive of it as a specific way of philosophizing. I assume that this type of, if one can forget about the negative connotations of the word in this usage for a while, rambling, then rambling has been a method of philosophy throughout its history in both East and West. So I'm talking about yo as a mode of philosophizing. Philosophers sometimes realize that their actual philosophical practice does not, as envisioned by authors like Descartes and Spinoza, consist in developing in a, so to speak, geometrical fashion a set of propositions into proven systems of certainties. What they do is rather a form of intellectual and linguistic rambling that, instead of leading to certain ends, establishes a form of communicatively productive discourses that they can enjoy or make their profession, and in some cases even both of them at the same time. Right? So again, yo as a form of doing philosophy in a playful-like way. One of the major philosophers of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, experienced a shift in attitude towards philosophy that led him from his early attempts to philosophize in a strictly systematic fashion to the insight that, at least for him, doing philosophy meant to ramble in this sense. So I think one can also, in a certain sense, interpret the turn from the early Wittgenstein to the late Wittgenstein, particularly the methodological term, as a shift towards philosophizing in a mode of yoing. Wittgenstein says as much in the preface to his philosophical investigations, and I quote from this preface of the philosophical investigations. It was my intention at first to bring all this together in a book whose forms I pictured differently at different times. But the essential thing was that the things should proceed from one subject to another in a natural order and without breaks. After several unsuccessful attempts to weld my results together into such a whole, I realized that I should never succeed. The best that I could write would never be more than philosophical remarks. My thoughts were soon crippled if I tried to force them on in any single direction against their natural inclination. And this was, of course, connected with the very nature of the investigation. For this compels us to travel over a wide field of thoughts, crisscross in every direction. The philosophical remarks in these books are, as it were, a number of sketches of landscapes, which were made in the course of these long and involved journeys. The same or almost the same points were always being approached afresh from different directions, and new sketches made. So again, I think it's a perfect description of this sort of childlike roaming as a method of doing philosophy, as opposed to this going from one point A to one point B of this sort of adult methodological form of doing philosophy. I go back to the text, back to the quotation. Very many of these sketches were badly drawn or uncharacteristic, marked by all the defects of a weak draftsman. And when they were rejected, a number of tolerable were left, which now had to be arranged and sometimes cut down so that if you looked at them, you could get a picture of the landscape. Thus, this book is really an album. End of the Wittgenstein preface. Perhaps, and this is then my conclusion, perhaps most philosophical books, if not all of them, are such albums, including, by the way, not the least, the Zhuangzi itself. This is, of course, not to say that the Zhuangzi and the philosophical investigations are similar in content, or that they were written in a similar way. They were not. But it is to say that it is a widespread illusion that philosophical writings are, or even are capable of, to quote Wittgenstein, proceeding from one subject to another in a natural order and without breaks. In real life, we may like to fool ourselves into believing that our emotions in this world, where we go and what we say, follow such a necessary development, and that we pursue goals and get things done. Similarly, philosophers sometimes like to fool themselves that they reach conclusions and that they get to results. Empirically speaking, our emotions in life may consist of individual passages from point A to point B, and our individual philosophical papers, like the one that I'm presenting right now, may also set out from somewhere and lead to certain points. In the larger context, though, it turns out that we are rambling in a highly contingent fashion, also philosophically. Contingency, of course, does not mean anything goes, just like the roaming of children does not mean anything goes. Communication in general, and philosophical communication in particular, is contingent upon its previous path and can only continue if further contingencies are open. One can only ramble on from whence one has arrived at. It is this whence, this wherefrom, that is at the center of contingency. We're always rambling on from a specific point that, for whatever reasons that are not even entirely clear to us, we have reached. It is not a larger, rationally determined or ultimately necessary scheme that guides our communicational motions. We rather operate in a highly complex environment. My philosophy teacher back in Germany, Josef Simon, used to say that the books one happened to read, or one happened to have read, one encountered, so to speak, or stumbled upon in one's life, are the formative elements for the books that one is later to write. So, in this sense, all communication and philosophical activity emerges within the context of such complex ramblings. And both that and how Zhuangzi and Heubel discuss the happiness of the fish has much less to do with a coherent approach towards any truth of the matter than with the contingent path of their ramblings. Their biographical rambling through life, their carefree rambling together on that day along the river How that day, and their previous intellectual ramblings that are that which enabled them to walk and talk in the way they do. And this, and not any actual happiness of the fish, is what allows them to construct such a thing as the happiness of the fish to begin with. That philosophers can make up such topics as the happiness of fish is a result of their ramblings. And these very ramblings constitute, so to speak, the happiness of the philosophers. This is from whence they can observe it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hans-Georg. This was a very interesting talk. Yeah, 我就是非常感谢Moeller教授这个精彩的演讲。对，就是简单来说，我来总结一下这个演讲重点，就是Moeller教授的报告有两个面向，一个比的是 historical philological， 一个是对汉学式的，第二个面向比的是哲学式的。那么他先对这个庄子文本的进行了很细心的阅读啊，所以他提到，特别是对一个游这个概念，游无尽之也游心啊，或者游无穷啊等等的这种表述方式啊，对这个游啊，逍遥游的游啊进行可以说汉学式的分析，然后它区别了两种意涵，一个是比较宗教式的或者比较神秘式的一种游啊，第二个是一种比较世俗的所谓的世俗的或者比较人见式的游rambling 所以它接下来重点是在那个第二种就是一种 mundane conversation 或是 religious elevation， 所以它比较强调这个游的一种的一种世俗的意涵所以接下来这个哲学的重点Moeller教授的哲学重点可能就在这里他提出一种主张就是我们不应该再把哲学活动理解为一种像笛卡尔和斯宾诺莎所说的一种集合学式的一种就是提出命题，然后讨论命题，然后建立一种系统性的哲学。他认为哲学活动应该比较像 rambling， 像这个游这样的进行，就是它无目标的游ing in the world。所以在最后非常强调，最后这个报告的最后2-3页非常强调这个 contingency， 这个偶然性。我们都不知道从什么地方出发，然后开始思考，开始 rambling， 然后然后做一些结论但是这样的一个思考活动可能都是非常偶然的。好，那请何发斌做一个回应。
Thank you very much, Kai, for this invitation. Thank you for this nice talk. And I will start with one question. Are there happy philosophers today? And if not, what does tell us about the philosophy of today and our relation to the Zhuangzi? The second aspect is the question of translation. And I will start with an aspect which I encountered recently, that is the question of a German sinologist if I would be interested in translating Zhuangzi into German. And when I somehow got beyond the shock of this question, I started to reflect on the question how one could or should attempt a translation of the Zhuangzi today. And that is to say, a translation of the Zhuangzi which would somehow try to correspond to the text itself and its structure. That is to say, a translation which would be very different from the translations we have in English or in German to date, especially different from the translations from the translation we have by Richard Wilhelm into German. And one aspect I was especially thinking about is the question how one could get away from the construction of an identical or a text constructed as a translated identity. That is, a text which in itself would be able to express this non-identical moment in the Zhuangzi, in the text of the Zhuangzi, which as a text is not a unity, and which also from the author, as far as we know, is rather a text written by different authors than a text written by one author. So there's a double question here. On the one hand, how can one get out of this constructions of a united text? And then how could one, in the way one deals with this text and its language, get into touch with this moment of the non-identical, which is so crucial for the philosophy of Zhuangzi. And one aspect, or one possible solution I was thinking about, is really to do this work with different translators, and somehow to encourage them to use their own language to translate different chapters. And in the end, not to try to unify this kind of translated text, but to keep it in a non-identical way. And in this sense, try to make it possible to get in the German language an idea of the internal heterogeneity of the book Zhuangzi. And this idea of really translating these texts from different perspectives and from different philosophical approaches, and to let these approaches just be somehow in a relation of anarchic harmony. This is something which I think is also important when thinking about the talk of Hans-Georg Moeller today and the philosophical questions he touched upon. Because when we think about contemporary philosophy, at least from a European perspective, I think what we somehow, of course, encounter from the start is what Professor Moeller mentioned in the part 6 of his paper. That is the question of what kind of philosophy, what kind of philosophizing we can imagine today, or what kind of philosophizing we want for ourselves today, in the end maybe to become happy philosophers and not only philosophy professors. So in this sense, I would say I completely agree to the perspective he has opened up in this last section, and would say that the question we of course somehow have in mind when we think about a possible encounter between contemporary European philosophy or contemporary European thought and the Zhuangzi is this moment which sets us free from philosophy as a system, from philosophy as a logical, consistent system. And of course, I think since the late 19th century at least, European philosophers have always been searching for philosophical possibilities which would allow us to integrate somehow, and I doubt whether integration is the right word here, but I use it for the moment to integrate the character of fragments, of discontinuity, of disintegration, of non-identity into philosophical thought. And Wittgenstein, of course, is one example, and there are many others. And the question, I think, we have to ask us today is whether this attempt has been somehow successful, or what can we learn from this development in the 20th century, and in which sense Zhuangzi goes even further than what philosophers in Europe in the 20th century have developed. And this is, for me, in this context, maybe one of the most interesting questions. Because if Zhuangzi would only somehow say what Nietzsche already has said, I think we do not really have to take the work on us to read the Zhuangzi. We can read Nietzsche. This will be quite enough. So the question would be, in which